Hi everyone, thank you for attending today's webinar on managing underperformance and misconduct. We'll just wait a minute or two just to see if we've got any latecomers before we start. Yep. My name is Marisa. For those who don't know me, I'm new to ProcessWorx and HR Advisor here. Just a little bit about myself so you know. So my background predominantly comes from internal recruitment, working for anywhere between small business firms to blue chip organisations. So I've got a wide variety of experience in a few different industries, from engineering to hospitality and retail. So hopefully some of that experience will come through if you ever have to call to seek my advice. As I said at the beginning of this session, we'll be looking at managing underperformance and misconduct. So I'll get started. So just a few housekeeping things. If you could make sure that your Zoom is on mute, that way we don't have a multitude of people talking at the same time, and hopefully you can hear me. I do note that there may be a delay sometimes with my talking to when you're hearing it, just because of the connection. If I am talking too fast, please do let me know. Just use your chat inbox. Any questions as well, please use the chat inbox to ask, and I'll try to answer them as we go through. Most of the questions, obviously, I'll probably answer at the end, but if there's anything that pops up, I will try as much as I can to answer them through the presentation here today. Okay. One last thing before I get started is that the session will be recorded. So that way people who are wanting to get this information, who have enlisted for today but weren't able to make it, we will obviously be sending out a copy of this to everyone who's registered for this session. Okay. Just bear with me. Okay. So to get us started, what we'll be looking at today is underperformance, the meaning of that, the difference between misconduct and serious misconduct, having a look through the disciplinary process, and in particular, using a case study to have a brief outline of what the PIP or performance improvement plan would look like. Then at the end, I'll have a brief discussion about what other considerations we should be thinking about, just in terms of supporting any potential unfair dismissal cases that may come about should any disciplinary process ends up being in a termination. Okay, so some of those things looking at reasonable management action, balance of probability, and procedural fairness. So let's start with underperformance. So what is underperformance? So underperformance is the unsatisfactory work performance, failure to perform duties in the position, unacceptable behaviour relating to performance. So for instance, if there is a performance meeting and that person decides to tell the whole world about their performance meeting, which causes a disruption to the workplace, that can be seen as obviously a disciplinary issue as well. Some common performance issues that you may come across in the workplace are the failure to follow reasonable instructions, not coming into work on time, being cynical at work, or appearing to not be able to perform to the best of their ability. I'm sure there's plenty more examples that you can probably think of that relate to your business. So why do people underperform? So it's really crucial to understand the reasoning behind why people underperform, because this will help determine the outcome that you choose as part of this disciplinary process. So some examples may be that they have a lack of training that comes out in the part of the discussion. So you may want to change your outcome from being, a warning to including some sort of support for them for training. So whether that be internal or external. There may have been personal issues outside of work that may be impacting their work. So we kind of want an understanding of what that is, how often that might impact their performance, and how we can support them in any way. So for example, if someone was coming into work every day late for 30 minutes, and then we have this sort of meeting with them to discuss about their underperformance in relation to being late all the time, it may come out that, they've got a child that is currently in hospital or something like that. So obviously that's going to change the discussion and the support that we give them as part of that performance improvement. Some other examples may be a lack of personal motivation. Do they even want to be there? Is this the right sort of job that they thought it was going to be or that they're wanting to pursue? So why do managers avoid dealing with poor performance? It's human nature, really. We generally don't like conflict. So we tend to avoid it at all costs as possible, especially if it means having a difficult conversation. So I know it's hard for, obviously, the person to hear that they're underperforming because it may come as a surprise to them, or that inappropriate behaviour because they may have gotten away with it for so long, or maybe they just don't care. But it also is difficult conversation for the person who's actually delivering it. Another reason why managers may avoid discussing performance or misconduct is that you have no time. You're too busy doing, your managerial duties or running the business and that sort of thing. So often we see that clients do come to us, asking for help, which is why we're here to help. But it is important to obviously deal with these performance and misconduct issues as soon as possible and quickly. We don't want to leave it too much down the track where the meaning or the seriousness behind actually doing the disciplinary action kind of goes out the window. So it's kind of like diluted it. Another one at the moment, which is a hot topic, is pretty much fear of losing the employee. I know recruitment for a lot of businesses is very hard at the moment, given obviously our current state of affairs with vaccinations and COVID and borders and restrictions, that people are actually afraid of losing their employee because at least it's a body. Unfortunately, it does take a lot of time to still manage that employee in the business rather than just trying to find someone else. Misconduct. So let's have a look at misconduct and what that actually means. So misconduct usually arises from poor sort of behaviour or behaviour that isn't desired, that comes from a breach of policies and procedures. Hopefully most of you, if not all of you, will have really good policies and procedures in place that will cover sort of like most of the main misconduct issues that may arise. So for instance, in terms of what policies and procedures may apply to those would be, the IT policy. You may have someone who's got excessive internet personal use. So that would be covered by the IT policy. There may be things like, smoking outside of the building or smoking in the working area, which would apply, that is part of the code of conduct. So sort of those things are covered mostly there. Another one that may come up in terms of the policies and procedures that are covered would be bullying and harassment. So that's usually a big one. And it could incorporate little sort of misconduct things like gossiping during work hours, especially when it's excessive time there. Or in terms of the PPE policy, failure to wear the correct uniform. So serious misconduct in comparison, as the name implies, is a little bit more serious. So these are things, like theft or assault or abuse and that sort of thing. It also can include discrimination and bullying, as long as the action is willful and deliberate and is inconsistent with the continuation of the employee's contract or creates an imminent threat or serious risk to the health and safety of a person. serious misconduct can often lead to people feeling uncomfortable in the workplace. So it's really important that we actually check in and immediately investigate these issues, because it may be a case that with enough supporting evidence that we may be able to do summary dismissal or instant dismissal. So let's have a look at a case study. So the case of Jim and his new employee, Jenny. So Jim has recently joined the organisation. He's a sales manager. He has 6 direct reports. And after a few months, he realises that Jenny is underperforming. Jenny has been with the company for over 12 months now, and she's just not meeting sales targets, appointment targets, or call targets. So there's 3 main factors there. So what are Jimmy's options? So Jim's options are, which is the most common thing that, we would like to obviously stay away from, is to get rid of Jenny. So we kind of want to move away from just getting rid of Jenny, because we don't know what the context is at this stage. We haven't given her an opportunity to respond or given her any forewarning that might happen. Another option is that we could meet with Jenny to discuss her performance. We could totally ignore it, or we could just get someone else to do it. Obviously, the most beneficial option would be number 2, which is to meet with Jenny to discuss her performance. So meeting with Jenny to discuss her performance, again, as I mentioned, that we should act quickly, especially in relation to as soon as a problem comes up and we go, oh, you know what, I'm too busy. It's too minor, I'll just leave it as it is, can actually become a more serious issue down the track. And a person can become disengaged from employment, which creates more of a performance issue. So if we act more quickly, ask the questions, discuss the situation and be specific about it, then we can obviously set the expectations about what the appropriate behaviour is early. With any sort of these discussions, you can offer a support person for Jenny if she wishes to do so, because some conversations may be hard. Obviously give her forewarning that the discussion will be happening, and make her a written record of the conversation. So even though it is an informal discussion, I would still make a file note on her personal file, just to kind of make the key notes of what was discussed and what was the agreed actions going forward in terms of the expected behaviour and how to improve. One key component of the conversation as well is to monitor the progress. So there's no good just having a chat and then not catching up with Jenny until she, does something wrong again, but to actually monitor the progress on a regular basis and give her some feedback. So if she is actually starting to do well, give her that feedback, so that way she feels motivated to keep on doing the right behaviours that you want in the business. So what happens if Jenny doesn't improve? And in fact, it actually gets worse. She hasn't met with a client for 2 weeks. She hasn't made any client phone calls, and she spends a great deal of time in front of a computer, pretty much doing nothing that you can tell. So what should Jenny do now? Obviously, we've done through the informal process, that now we should actually be starting the formal process. But what does that actually mean? So in terms of performance, that means doing a performance improvement plan. Okay, so we do have to assess the problem and in the performance improvement plan, meet with the employee, finalise the PIP as it's called, and then again monitor and review their performance. Now, if we break that down a little and start with identifying the problem. So when we look at the problem, we need to write that down to be a little bit more specific. So we can't just say, look, you're not performing, things aren't working out, you need to kind of up your game. That's not going to be specific enough for Jenny, because obviously if she knew what the problem was, then she wouldn't be doing it. So we need to be a little bit more specific. So that's where pretty much the SMART principles would come in as well. So if you can say with Jenny in particular that, Jenny, you're not actually meeting with the client, You're not making the specific phone call targets of, 10 per day, what's going on, sort of thing. Obviously, describe clearly what the action needs to be taken, your expectation of that, and again, be specific and be timely as well, like how much, when, how often, those sorts of things. Set out any resources that will be made available to them. So for instance, if you think that they need training or just need some catch-up team one-on-one just to check in about how the progress is going, identify those early on and how you can help support them in being more successful in their role. Advise the employee of the meeting before at least 24 hours before. This gives them enough notice, reasonable notice for them to be prepared for the meeting so they're not blindsided. So here on the screen we have an example of what a PIP looks like in terms of the template. So these are available on the HR portal. For those that don't have it on the HR portal, for instance, some of our farm clients, this is available for you at no additional cost. We do purposely keep this off the portal so that way it doesn't clutter your system. For small business, this is already available on your system. So here we look at the areas of improvement, the actions for improvement. So what is it that you actually want them to do? So you want Jenny to make 3 phone calls to her clients or 3 clients per day, then you need to actually specify that. And how often do you want to do it? So that in that example, that was per day. Also need to kind of outline as well what the success would look like in terms of success criteria. So how do we actually know that Jenny's improving? So this may include things like feedback from clients, that they're actually giving her a call, or it may be an increase in sales because the fact that she's making that call, the sales targets are actually being reached. Set a date. So achievement date means obviously when are you going to catch up with Jenny to make sure that she's actually actioned those improvement criteria, and also to give her feedback during that time. So if she has met it, go, yep, great Jenny, you've been doing a great job. We want you to continue that. How can we continue to support you doing that? If not, then obviously we need to continue that discussion towards disciplinary action. As before, when I mentioned about, being specific about the improvement that's needed, a good tool to use is SMART goals. So that's being specific, being measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. So an example that I gave before about Jenny, so the specific task that you want her to do is that you want her to make, you want actually her to meet her target of making calls. Being measurable, so how many times do you want her to do it? So 3 times or 4 times a week is an example, and that's also including the time-bound. Now, it's achievable in terms of, it's only a few a week rather than 200 a day, so that could be seen as unreasonable in that respect. Okay, and is it relevant? Is it actually to do with her function? So you wouldn't put it on there that I want Jenny to make a cup of coffee for me every day. That's not really relevant to her job unless that is a function of her role. So stage 3 is to meet with the employee. So there are 5 P's, as we say, to getting ready for your formal performance meeting. So that's 1 is obviously to prepare, as we've prepared the PIP. Make sure that when you have the meeting, you organise for somewhere to be private. There's nothing worse than being obviously told that you're not doing a great job in public. It can be quite embarrassing for a lot of people, and it could create a sense of defensiveness and obviously turn the conversation to be one of participation and improvement to being hostile. The third P is participate. So it is a 2-way conversation. You're not just talking at her, this is what we want to do, this is when you want to do it. We want that conversation to be 2-way. So that way she has a bit of a buy-in and actually wants to be motivated to improve as well. So there may be some suggestions that you would take or Jim would take from Jenny in this case. about what she can improve in and how she can do it, and to do it realistically. Okay. And again, it has to be realistic. So it can't be like, Jim, do my job for me. It also has to be precise. So that's when you kind of follow those SMART principles about it being specific and time bound. And obviously there's a plan. So a plan that's followed. It's not just a good piece of paper that's, good for now. I'll just, file it away and that's the last time we hear about it. It's a plan that we follow up and review in our next meeting. So in terms of those achievement dates. And finalise the PIP. So incorporate those suggestions that were part of the discussion, sign the PIP, and obviously put them onto the employee record. Now, some things that the employee may suggest would be, for instance, training. Obviously include those as part of the discussion, and do follow up with those in terms of, arranging or setting up. It could be internal, it could be external training, for example, as well. Monitor and review progress. So it's important to keep track of the progress, so that way the performance that you're trying to elicit is actually continuing. At any sort of time that it's not continuing, at least you're telling that person, so that they're aware of not only the consequences of the continued underperformance, but also that they're acknowledged for any improvement that they do make. So obviously there are 3 different potential incomes from a PIP. So there's, full improvement. Thank you very much, Jenny. I really appreciate that you've really stepped up to your game in these areas, and I hope that that continues in the future. If there's anything that I can help you with to continue that, please let me know. Second, there's an extension of the PIP. So they might need another PIP where they have actually followed or improved in some areas, but however, in some, they still need more improvement. So the case may be that they need another PIP, and potentially a warning to kind of create that solid support to potentially if we need to terminate down the track. The third outcome may be that there is little to no improvement. So again, we would definitely start looking at formal disciplinary action in terms of written warnings and that sort of thing, to support potentially terminating that person in the future should their improvement still be below bar, or there's no progression whatsoever. So frequently asked questions. So what happens, some of the emotive situations where if Jenny cries, if she gets abusive, if, she disagrees with the point of view, then what do you do? So remember that we're all human. So unfortunately, we're not robots that don't have these emotions. So we do need to act with, empathy and care and understanding those situations. So give them the room to have a little bit of cry, or, discuss their point of view and how they disagree. At the end of the day, with the PIP, if they decide, I disagree with the PIP, I believe that my performance is great, and I'm not going to sign the PIP, what does that mean? Obviously, with the signature on the PIP, it's not an acknowledgement for them that they're underperforming, but rather acknowledgement that they've attended these meetings, to confirm that these discussions have been had and that they're aware. Don't be too worried if they do still not sign. As long as the record is there on file, it's regularly updated, it will still stand if things do progress into terms of a negative path. It may be a case as well, if it is quite of a emotive situation, they do become angry and abusive, that you nip that in the bud and go, look, I don't appreciate your anger. I don't appreciate, how this conversation is going. Perhaps we need to pause the conversation and come back again when obviously we're feeling a little bit more calm about the situation. Sometimes things are better done in writing as well. So having a copy of the PIP, which would get given to the employee anyway, they have a chance to look over those things and have a nice discussion afterwards. Okay. One common thing that sometimes we get is that the person may go accusing you of bullying because they feel like they're being micromanaged or something like that. Again, Discussing, especially an open discussion, two-way discussion about their performance isn't bullying, it's reasonable management action. So it wouldn't be considered bullying in that respect. So let's move on to the disciplinary process. So what happens if Jenny continues to not improve significantly or just doesn't want to and is really disengaged? Obviously, with the disciplinary process, we need to have a valid reason. So, and then valid reason are things like, they're in breach of their policy and procedure, is mainly a key issue, or they're not performing in their role. Then we need to invite them to that disciplinary process. And then the third is having that meeting. Now, you could go through this a few times depending on the seriousness of the reason that you're having this meeting. So, for instance, if you have someone who is late, 20 minutes for a long period of time versus someone who is, stealing from the company in terms of goods and products, maybe a quicker process in that respect of the disciplinary process. So breaking that down for you, a valid reason. So as I mentioned, ongoing performance issues would be a valid reason. Misconduct such as fraud, sexual harassment, bullying, discrimination, misuse of email, violation of health and safety requirements. Most of it, as mentioned before, would be in relation to some sort of breach of policy and procedure. So now that you've got a valid reason for going through the disciplinary process, you would invite them to that disciplinary meeting. Yeah. Often you would give about 24 hours notice. You obviously can give more, but you want to give less. The reason why is you want them to have reasonable time to be able to prepare for the meeting or to bring in a support person should they wish to do so. Always offer them to bring a support person. They don't have to bring one, but if they do, they can. Obviously, the role of a support person is to be there to support them. It's not to advocate or to speak on their behalf, but should things obviously be quite, emotional for them, they have someone who they are comfortable to be with to be there for them. Okay. We do have a template letter that is available in terms of giving notification of a disciplinary meeting. Those who have used it before will see that we do have a list in there as well, just preparing them for any allegations that may be raised in that meeting. Now, obviously, if it's, a small or minor thing, it may not be listed out, as allegation 1, allegation 2, that sort of thing. It may just be, a single paragraph. However, there are instances when there are multiple breaches of policy and procedure and then allegations need to be made. One key point that needs to be made is even if, you do have solid supporting evidence like a video of someone not performing or displaying in misconduct, we still list it as an allegation to them to be put in the disciplinary meeting. Okay, because the idea behind a meeting is that we're giving them an opportunity to respond. So moving forward to the meeting, so the day of the meeting's happening, what can we expect? So we go into the meeting with an open mind, or we don't go in there with a predetermined outcome. The reason why we do that is we want to consider what their side of the story is. There may be something that we don't know about, for instance, something happening in their personal life, or some sort of system that's creating a barrier for them to be successful in their role. So we want to be able to consider their side of the story. From a compliance perspective, it is one of the key things in terms of procedural fairness that the Fair Work Commission do look at in terms of determining whether a dismissal is fair at the end of the day. In the meeting, we then obviously, after listening to their response, we discuss with them the next steps. So the next steps would obviously be to take away what they've said and consider it. We usually allow about 24 hours or so just to adequately and reasonably consider what their response is. If the issue is a little bit more complex or serious, we may take a little bit longer. Or if something's come to light where they've got a witness that may support their case, we may delay it to investigate further or to get that witness's statement, for instance. During the meeting, do take comprehensive notes. You will need those for when you're drafting up your warning letter, or if you're doing your file note, depending on how the situation or outcome ends up being. So after that 24 hours of sort of consideration, if there's a few things to consider that have been raised, you would then have an outcome meeting. So outcome meeting will deliver what the disciplinary action is, or no disciplinary action. So you can take no action if there's part of that consideration determines that, it's actually not something that can be seen as a warning, so it's not serious enough. Or something may come to light where then you've had to have further investigation where it's actually more serious than you thought, and there may be actually termination involved. Okay. The outcome of a disciplinary process should always be in writing, just to confirm that they've been spoken to about the allegations. The allegations have either been substantiated or unsubstantiated, and what the outcome is. So that would be a first written warning, a first and final written warning, a second written warning, whatever the case may be, and the consequences of, there being no improvement, or should they do it again, that they're aware that termination might be on the table. Okay, and that's really important to note. Some other considerations. So other considerations that we might look at, for instance, when determining with the discussion, would be reasonable management action. So as I mentioned before, performance management, if done the right way and procedurally fair, with a valid reason, is reasonable management action. Okay. So having similarly, performance appraisals, reasonable management action, investigating an allegation, reasonable management action. So what wouldn't be a case if you were having that discussion with the employee about their performance and you started, attacking them personally, calling them lazy and that's why they're not performing and that sort of thing. That could be construed as bullying, which then becomes not reasonable management action. So we need to, obviously, when discussing their performance behaviour, keep it to that performance behaviour. So if they're not, in the case of Jenny, making the targeted phone calls per day, that is obviously your reason. Not adding, any sort of subcontext to go that, oh, you're not making any phone calls today because you don't want to, you're just lazy, you don't want to work here anymore. So that's really more of a projection of a personal judgment. Another thing to consider when doing these investigations and discussions about performance and misconduct to determine what the outcome would be is that we're not a court of law. So in terms of the employment space, we don't have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that someone did it or that they haven't done it. It's on the balance of probabilities. So what's the likelihood that they have done it based on the evidence provided? So this is where it's good to have as much evidence as possible. For instance, client feedback in the case of Jenny, or, in the case of theft, is their record of timesheets, for instance, if they're cutting their time, is there video surveillance if, there's physical assault. All those help support, obviously, a case. However, that hard evidence isn't usually always available. So that's where, obviously, then we rely on first judgment. Is there any history of conduct issues? Is there any history of performance issues? How long have they been with the company? Are they actually aware of the policies and procedures that are in place that determine, obviously, their expected performance and conduct? Procedural fairness. So I've talked a lot about procedural fairness throughout today. So this is the guiding principle of how we actually guide our conversations. Now, this isn't only important to make sure that we're fair to the employee and that we're treating them with respect in this process, but also it's an underlying principle that the Fair Work Commission actually look for when determining whether a unfair dismissal case is harsh, unjust, or unreasonable. So with procedural fairness, we need to make sure that during these meetings or during these investigations that they're full and extensive, that we've given an employee 24 hours notice of their disciplinary meeting or more so, that they're aware they're allowed to have a support person, that you've got sufficient information to understand the allegations. So does it actually make sense? And it's clear and concise in that way. Have they had the opportunity to respond to the allegations? So not only just in terms of time, but in terms of listening as well. Or are you just on your phone, whilst in the meeting, looking at messages whilst they're going on about potential reasons why they're underperforming? And that's where the generally considers an employee's response comes in as well. So not only to be present in those meetings, but also to have another 24 hours after that disciplinary meeting before delivering the outcome. As mentioned before, the Fair Work Commission will look at a variety of things, but these are the key things. And as you can see, a lot of these things do actually align with procedural fairness. So having a valid reason for actually looking at a disciplinary action or termination, giving notification, giving them an opportunity to respond, allowing them to have a support person, and having that performance discussion in writing as well is important. So that way it's clear to them what it is they've done, what are the agreed actions going forward, what's the consequences of them not improving. Okay. So in terms of being reasonable, so following on from harsh, unjust, and unreasonable, so what is reasonable? The employee's actions have created a need for management action. So have they actually done something that is actually in breach? Or is it the case of, the opposite of being reasonable in that case would be, you just don't like them. So you just want to create a performance issue for them. So that wouldn't be considered reasonable. Do the particular circumstances of the employee were considered? So is there any sort of personal issues happening at home that you're aware of that may be impacting their performance that haven't been taken into consideration? Have you taken into consideration how long they've been with you? So an employee of 10 years versus someone who's new, that can impact how reasonable an action may be as well. Whether or not you should have prompted a simple inquiry to uncover any further circumstances. Are there established policies and procedures in place that were followed or were not followed? Whether investigations were carried out in a timely manner. You don't want, for instance, in the terms of the example that I gave about time, where someone's coming into work late all the time, to leave it 2-3 months before, investigating it and doing disciplinary action. Because then it kind of almost seems like it was an accepted practice, which then it wouldn't be a reasonable action to be talking to that person about it, because specifically and not create a standard there. And was it carried out in a reasonable manner? So were they offered a support person? Did they have enough time to have an opportunity to respond? Those sorts of things. So termination. So let's have a look quickly at what an example of poor termination might look like.
I got something to say, and I'm going to get it out. Hammond, listen to me. I am sorry that your dog died, and that your wife is divorcing you, and that your life is falling apart, and that these guys missed your birthday. And there is no easy way to say, what are you doing? What's going on? Oh, God. Oh, come on. You're not going to pull that, are you? Oh, yeah, right. Now we're falling onto the ground. Well, nice try, but guess what? You're fired. You're fired. You get it? You hear me? You're gone. You're fired.
Okay, so in terms of that video, obviously that's a very poor example of termination. Now, for many reasons, as you can probably see. So a few of them are, that it's in a crowded room. There's no privacy about, that termination at all. The second is there's no opportunity for him to respond. Obviously, he couldn't respond in this instance, but Ted kept on going on and about how, he was going to be fired. The third thing is he brought his, personal issues into light. So it wasn't really about his performance at all or his misconduct. It was all about his personal issues, and that was the reason for termination. So in fact, that termination probably wouldn't be valid. It'd be considered unlawful termination in that respect. I'm sure there's a few other things I'm pointing in there because there's a lot of things wrong with that termination process.
I got something to say.
Okay, so types of termination. So there are different types of termination. There are a few here on the screen for you. Obviously, unsuccessful probation would probably be the first line of call. So that would be the first 6 months. So you don't have to necessarily go through the formal disciplinary process during probation for them to be terminated because of that. So that's usually during that time where it could be a few minor things, or it could be just cultural fit and those sorts of things, attitude, that you can have a good reason for terminating them on their probation. However, once probation has concluded, so 6 months and 1 day, they automatically become a permanent employee. So it is highly recommended that you have regular, even if it's informal discussions during their probation period, to give them feedback about how they're going, and even to record those on file as well. Okay. So, I've got a question here about, is it the first 6 months? And yes, so in most of the contract templates that we have, it will be the first 6 months. Under law, it is the first 6 months. Some contracts that you may do, you can have probation just for the first 3 months, and it can be extended by another 3 months, but maximum period would be 6 months. Other types of termination is notification with notice, and obviously summary dismissal is another one, which is instant dismissal. So those were for those serious misconduct issues. Now, where different types of termination where it's on the negative side is obviously unfair dismissal. So those are things where, either we haven't had a valid reason or we haven't gone through procedural fairness, and unfair dismissal may occur. Unlawful termination is when what you think may be a valid reason isn't actually valid. So it may be a termination that is covered by a general protection. So for instance, discrimination, being a member of a union. So those are unlawful terminations, to terminate people based on those things. Constructive dismissal is one to kind of consider as well, just to be careful of. So constructive dismissal is usually when an employee feels like they have no other alternative but to resign. So they may, create a claim for constructive dismissal. So if you made their life extremely difficult, and not in terms of what we're talking about, in terms of, discussions and opportunity to improve and opportunity to provide their response, we're talking none of that. You're just making their life hell by, purposely making it difficult for them to come in to work every day and yelling at them and stuff like that, then they may be able to file for constructive dismissal. So usually I do a quiz at this point. Obviously, being a webinar, it might be a bit difficult, so I'll go through them one by one. So myth or fact, you can fire someone on the spot. Now, this is actually a fact. So in terms of summary dismissal, as we were talking about, that is an actual option. Obviously, the criteria about having the discussion with the employee, about having their response to the allegations is still pertinent, so it still rings true. in terms of the procedural fairness, but there are avenues, obviously, in terms of summary dismissal for someone to be terminated on the spot. You must give 3 warnings before terminating anyone. This is actually a myth. As we've described before, you can terminate someone on the spot through summary dismissal. In the case of underperformance or just misconduct, as opposed to serious misconduct, it can be after 2 warnings. So you can have a first warning and then a final warning after that, or you can even have a first and final warning before moving on to termination, depending on the seriousness of the conduct. You don't have to give a reason why you're getting rid of someone if you have under 15 employees. This is actually a myth. You do. So the only time that you don't have to give a specific reason is when someone is on probation. But even then, it's kind of best practice to give them understanding through informal feedback before then of why they're underperforming or the conduct isn't meeting expected standards for the business. An employee can be reinstated into their position if an unfair dismissal is awarded. That is actually a fact. So that is true. So obviously, this is where procedural fairness most of the time kicks in, that a lot of the cases that we see or case law that we see where a case is valid in terms of the reason for termination, but procedural fairness hasn't been done. So they were either not offered a support person or opportunity to respond or reasonable time to respond, that their unfair dismissal claim is actually upheld. And reinstatement can be one of those things that are awarded. Procedural fairness does not apply to businesses with less than 15 employees. That is actually a myth. So, sorry, I've just got a question here. How do you manage an employee's performance who goes on sick leave due to stress every time a manager wants to review their performance, i.e., you don't get an opportunity to have a discussion? So, again, it depends what their stress is related to. So if they're stressing about, personal issues that are happening in their life, obviously it's not related to their performance. But any time that they have sick leave off, they need to provide a medical certificate. Okay. So if they've got a genuine sickness, they will need to get that to obviously delay, I guess, those discussions. And we need to give reasonable time for them to recover. So for instance, yes, it does obviously slow down the process. However, there does come to a certain point. Again, there's no hard and fast rule about how much time, but just a reasonable time. So if that person ends up being, on stress for a month, all on medical certificates, what do you do with that? You can still obviously have that discussion with them or notify them that this discussion still needs to be resolved and it still needs to be discussed, and we want to give you an opportunity to hear your side of the story. Otherwise, in terms of the performance, it's really hard to still continue the discussions if they're not there. However, if it's a case of misconduct, there's obviously, like I said, with the balance of probability, you can still have those meetings or continue to have those meetings based on the balance of probability. So given the evidence that you have before you, you can still deliver an outcome based on that, okay? So if they choose not to have a response, then you can still deliver an outcome based on that. Okay, so follow-up question from that discussion piece is we all know you can get a medical certificate quite easily. Can we insist they come to a disciplinary meeting? Again, that depends on the scenario and what's accepted practice. So for instance, if your policy, I would say that often than not, there are policies with leave policies that a medical certificate needs to come from a medical practitioner rather than, an online, click and get medical certificate or even from a pharmacist. So some people do, as part of their policy, restrict that. However, in answer to the question, can you still insist on disciplinary action? Look, if they've got a medical certificate, you would have to delay that disciplinary action or disciplinary meeting for as reasonable as possible. So a reasonable time, like I said, is subjective. However, if it's a month down the track and they're still sick because of that issue, you can still try to continue that discussion. Perhaps try other means. For instance, is it better if it's over the phone instead of being in person, which isn't ideal, but is a possibility. And all of these can obviously be written into the PIP. So PIP again stands for Performance Improvement Plan. So moving on to best practice framework. So all these systems that are in place is a good framework for actually setting you up for success for any sort of performance improvement discussion that you have, or dealing with any sort of disciplinary issue regarding misconduct. So those include, a robust recruitment process, hiring the right person who is suitable for the culture and the fit first time round, a solid understanding of the business's purposes and values. So what's actually expected of me, the comprehensive induction. So have they actually got all the appropriate training that they need to be successful? It's no good just, going, okay, you're an experienced person, here you go, and not getting them the context of how your business actually does things and what's the expected standard there. Setting those clear expectations can be done through position descriptions and KPIs. Having solid policies and procedures. Hopefully most of you will have access to a portal through us, which have a lot of templates and guides that you have access to. Anything that isn't there, obviously, we will be able to assist you with to refine as well. Managing the probation. Use those 6 months to actually determine whether that employee is actually going to be suitable for your business earlier on, not just in terms of performance, but in terms of the culture as well. Ongoing feedback and training. So again, it shouldn't be a surprise to them, hopefully, by the time you actually go through that disciplinary process, because you've actually given ongoing feedback. That creates a more pleasant experience for both of you in terms of, discussing underperformance and misconduct. Regular performance appraisals. That's obviously to realign those standards and expectations, and, change as the business grows as well. And formal and informal performance management. Obviously, all that, as I said earlier, it's really important to be timely about that. The longer things are left, the easier it is to argue that it's an unaccepted practice or that's not what was expected. So, for instance, if someone's been getting away with coming up, half an hour late, for 6 months, then that's kind of an accepted practice. So you need to start again from the beginning in terms of having those informal discussions, rather than going, at the end of that period where you've had these discussions with them throughout those 6 months, to go, look, now we're having, a first and final warning, or even final warning, that it's just not acceptable. We can't keep on going on the business. We're kind of losing, productivity and money potentially. So on the portal, here are some of the common things that you would see. So with the policies and procedures, your employees will see those as well to help guide you. Additional to that, in the guidance notes, for those who are in small business, you will see this array of templates, including workflow on what are the steps for managing misconduct, managing serious misconduct or gross misconduct, and a workflow and steps on how to manage underperformance. Now, for those on the farms, you may not have this full range, but we will supply those to you and help you through those as and when you need. So those are available to you, but they just may not be on your portal sort of ready to go. Okay. We also have a question. So can a cause or reason of underperformance be linked to behaviours or factors outside of work time? For example, you find that they drink alcohol to excess and a continuous lack of sleep due to family factors. Yes, so in terms of how you would manage that particular scenario, it wouldn't be based on focusing on their personal reason for their lack of productivity or their timeliness to come to work. You would focus on the specific behavioural or underperformance at work. So for instance, in this case, are they actually fit? So are they fit to perform their duties? And that will come under the fit for work policy. So that's something that you can talk to them about rather than the drinking of alcohol to excess. It'll be, are you actually coming to work fit for work? Or the lack of sleep due to family factors. So again, that's the sort of fit for work, occupational health and safety. But the discussion would be really, instead of going, coming to work late all the time or underperforming, would be more of a case of, okay, so we know that these are the issues that are happening at work, and we understand and we're considerate of the fact that, you've told us it may be because of these issues. How can we support that? So, for instance, they may be, in that case, going, do we need to temporarily change your working hours, if possible, to kind of suit around that? Or do you need to take some time off, so in terms of annual leave, just to kind of, reset yourself or, seek additional support? In the case of drinking alcohol to excess, do we need to refer them to, go see their doctor or to go see a counsellor to discuss those personal issues? But beyond that, we wouldn't actually list that as a reason for talking to them about their performance. It would actually be the performance or behaviour that is actually being displayed at work that we'd be discussing. So that concludes the end of my presentation. Are there any other questions in relation to the content that's been displayed today? If not, a copy of the webinar recording will be sent to all attendees. So if you need to go back and have a re-listen or have a look at the slides or some of the material that we've discussed today, you can do so. Any questions? No? Well, thank you so much for attending today, and hopefully you were able to pick up a few things in terms of your process and how to handle these sorts of difficult conversations. If not, don't worry, we are always here to support as well. We're just a phone call away or an email away as you need. And hopefully I get a chance to meet some of you or have a chat to you in the future. Thank you.